Resident Evil 2 is a remake whose creative directions are mostly respected, but have some notable outliers. Looking through some examples of unusual decisions as well as the reception to the game as a whole is a good way of gauging what were some of the central philosophies that were driving the game. Resident Evil 2 is strange as a remake, as it's not a loose remake nor a rigid remake, and the final game is bizarre when examined too closely. The structure of Scenario A and Scenario B for each character, or second as it's referred to in the remake, kind of indicates the bizarre approach they went for. First Birkin fight. Both characters in both scenarios break through the floor, fight Birkin and have a ladder drop, then have to adjust a bridge. It feels like a Scenario B area given that the flooring is completely gone in the cutscene, but it could have just as easily been Leon B only, since Claire's requires the tipped over shelf to obstruct her path, which he just opens up anyway. Claire's boss battle also has storyline building dread and danger while setting up Sherry to be protected, as opposed to Leon where Birkin just kinda shows up. There's also a bridge that seems like a leftover obstacle with no function. Like Birkin was originally supposed to have a key, but they couldn't figure out a reason why. The fight in question also seems like much more of a Claire thing since her entire story revolves around the Birkins, far more than Leon's anyway. In the original game, Scenario A would face a G-adult while Scenario B would face Birkin, and in both cases you were just going to open a door or climb a ladder. But with G-adults becoming a normal enemy in the sewers, they couldn't figure out a substitute. Areas like this feel unfinished on repeat playthroughs, as if they stitched together pieces from different parts of multiple cutscenes that made for the best experience when put together, but with no regard for how this impacts the world building. For a more gameplay-oriented difference, there's the room before the morgue. You can either get a room full of dogs that are vulnerable before eventually being released, or you can get lickers that are tricky to get around. You'd think the one that gives you the means to make things easier would be Scenario A, while the more restrictive lickers would be Scenario B, especially since the lickers are eating the dogs, indicating that this is the time after the dogs were the main threat. But no, the dogs are Leon's scenario and the lickers are Claire's scenario. This isn't incomplete, it's just a very strange choice given that Scenario B is largely defined by more options but more dangerous conditions. A few areas seem underused. The Claire B East Wing safe room, Leon's jail cell area, Leon's sewer entrance, the open air balcony behind Iron's office, the linen room, the interrogation rooms, the third floor area above the helicopter crash, and the morgue. Given the rest of the room's layered and multi-purpose design, these seem strangely out of place. Mr. X breaks through walls a few times in cutscenes, and once this opens up a usable path. But my question is, why doesn't he break through walls all the time this way? This opens up interesting navigations and scare opportunities. Speaking of underutilized mechanics, they established through one of the photos that you can develop that finding a picture could allow you to find hiding spots. Why didn't this get used all the time in Scenario B? It's fitting as an extension of the original strange design of rewarding blind searches and is in and of itself an explanation as to why one character can find items that the other can't. So, all this being said, what's the weird design philosophy that drives all these inconsistencies? If it might suck, don't develop it. Cutscenes where Birkin exhibits more human behavior and acts more aggressively like an antagonist might look goofy and seem like a lamer Mr. X, so instead he just kinda pops in and stops you from moving forward. With Claire's weapons, lickers can be dealt with so there would actually be strategy and options, unlike Leon who would just be stuck with sneak or grenades. On a similar note, Claire's handguns are trickier to use against dogs since they're much slower, and her grenade launcher is way too slow to deal with a rush of dogs. The underused areas are likely because of Mr. X, because trying to expand RPD any further only risked places where Mr. X could actually become impossible to deal with. Also, making the smaller rooms more layered could make it trickier to scavenge for items quick enough before Mr. X comes in and punches you in the face. A lot of the magic of Mr. X is in how he feels like he's consistently hunting you but doesn't always know where you are. If he's constantly bopping in through walls, it might make him seem overly scripted, similar to what ultimately happened with Nemesis in the Resident Evil 3 remake. While I like the idea of using more hidden item locations, I could see this being either too obvious of a method of hiding items or too obscure depending on what locations are chosen. Especially since you would have to hunt for these locations while also being hunted by Mr. X. So yeah. a lot of frustration could happen. A lot of the irritation of horror games comes from feeling like there's only one right solution while struggling to figure out what it is or failing to execute it. And it feels like the team explored the options, and rather than work out creative solutions to specific problems, they just used the ones that worked and left it there. It seems like they wanted the player to have a lot of options no matter the situation, but it pretty much destroys the two scenarios being cohesive at all, and leads to a lot of times where cutscenes or mechanics feel underdeveloped. These examples set, let's talk about the negatively received elements of the remake, from least controversial to most controversial. And the most consistent, least controversial flaw of them all is repetitive and frustrating bosses. In the original games, bosses were hard to learn, but usually could just be completely washed by using the best weapons and ammo. Usually they were tests of your ammo conservation and weapon knowledge more than tests of skill. This still basically holds true, but because the bosses were all made much tankier, the hard to learn element is now much bigger than it ever was in any previous Resident Evil game. The harder difficulty on both standard and difficult makes the learning much more trial and error than most people would enjoy, since you're usually 2 hits away from death, and paired with some of the longer lead up to the fights, this can be very frustrating to replay. You can eventually figure out strategies, but like fighting Nemesis in the original Resident Evil 3, it can feel like a search to find an exploit rather than an enemy you have to learn. Incidentally, the main exploit is almost always the knife. Annette dying twice. They obviously wanted her to have a conclusive finish with either character's scenario A's, but couldn't think of a better one for scenario B. Hilariously, the story playing out as it does meant Annette was at 2 places at once. Mr. X dying twice. If this is supposed to be a fake-out death, it's a bit overkill. Like Annette, they obviously wanted both characters to have a conclusion for an important villain, it's just that there is no way this could be a fake-out. Very little interaction between Claire and Leon. Once again, they clearly want each scenario to feel self-contained, but it makes the start and end of the game feel really bizarre, as Claire and Leon barely have any interaction between each other. The structure of playing the 4 scenarios from one menu also means that elements like the zap system, the anti-BOW gas, and the fingerprint lock really couldn't return since the scenarios aren't interconnected anymore. This is more of a creative direction than an inherent flaw, but one that most wish wasn't taken. The reuse of keys and puzzle pieces. This tends to be forgiven because this was also the case in the original, but even that one had unique items for Claire and Leon to access the sewers, and given that the medallions have 2 sides to them, it's strange to not make the keys completely different between the scenarios. Hell, they're barely different between the characters. They mostly serve to guide Leon and Claire through different paths to the same goal. This does still work, but it seems like an obvious flaw in the original game to fix. Now, I'm not going to defend these flaws, as many of these are what I myself wanted fixed from the original game. But I actually did find the main idea behind these flaws. Assume the player is only going to play the game once. Why would you bother making unique locks and puzzles if most people aren't going to see them? If you think most people aren't going to play both scenarios, why would you increase the amount of time Leon and Claire spend together? In fact, why would you introduce systems that most players aren't going to see the consequences of? If both characters have 3 main villains, why would you leave any of their demises off-screen? The original game is not really 4 games in one as fans have often touted. It's closer to 2 long but similar campaigns, each having 2 different halves. Rather than actually creating 4 games, they made 4 similar campaigns. The only criticism exempt from this philosophy are the bosses, which is probably why they're the most universal complaint. According to their website, nearly 80% of players chose Leon, who has a much worse time against bosses, which might mean the ubiquity of the bosses as the negative point is merely the negative apex of all the game's most punishing features. Other than that, these flaws seem more like the consequences of an economical approach combined with common knowledge around games, providing opportune places to cut corners at the expense of variety. Now that's what's universally seen as the negatives of this game. I'd like to bring up some things that are good about this game that oftentimes aren't brought up. The big overlooked positive of this game are the sewers and nest. The praise of this game usually extends as far as the RPD, but I actually think the real improvements to this game are what's afterwards. The sewers were previously an item challenge of bringing easy-to-forget items to continue. That, combined with the simple design of the nest, turns the last third of the game into a pretty linear obstacle course with a few pit stops to slow down the action. In the remake, the sewers and nest feel much more in line with the RPD. Unlike the original, which is more of an ammo dump, these parts really feel like an environment to explore and learn. Not as well done as the RPD, but still very good. Next, the differences between Leon and Claire. In short, Claire's grenade launcher is better for lickers, IVs, G-adults, and bosses, but they're also much less appropriate for dogs than normal zombies compared to Leon. She also needs a lot of smart inventory management and strategy when using her grenade launcher because different ammo types take up more space and every shot is slow and takes time to fully set in. This makes Claire's campaign much scarier around normal zombies, but makes dealing with unusual zombies really rewarding. Leon's shotgun encourages risky play since it's best close up, but also makes it possible to clear rooms very quickly. His handguns also have much larger clips than Claire, so he can constantly and steadily pepper in damage without necessarily needing to create distance. While some of these elements were in the original, it pretty much came down to weak gun and strong guns. And much of the utility is easy to miss. While some bemoan that the shotgun is nerfed from the original since it can no longer decapitate 4 zombies at once, I like that the weapons make Claire and Leon feel different to play. The chess piece plug puzzles. Something that people forget about the original RE2 is that the puzzles were really brain dead. RE1 had some brain teasers and RE3 had some notorious roadblocks, but RE2 has puzzles so basic you'd think they were in RE5 or RE6. Hell, Resident Evil 5 has a harder puzzle than Resident Evil 2 ever does. That's why I'm quietly impressed by the inclusion of a few good puzzles, mainly the plugs. They evolve from a basic key collection quest into 2 sets of puzzles, get out of the room with 2 pieces, and getting past a locked door. You can pretty easily brute force through the former, but I really respect the locked door puzzle for being relatively restrained with the clues and making the player figure it out. It's also worth noting that Scenario B actually has a different solution, as the clue is harder to interpret and it even messes with your expectations. I never hear anyone mention this part of the game, but I always liked the way it came out. The strange thing about these additions to the original is that they were also the most overlooked element of the original game. Once you leave RPD, the main thing everyone remembers is just the story beats and boss fights. Few people ever really remember that the sewers were kinda boring and the nest was kinda linear. The puzzles in the original were more akin to, did you bring this item that you had no reason to keep with you? As far as the principle, fix what didn't work, this is probably the most underappreciated element of that. I'm actually very sad how overlooked the weapon difference between Leon and Claire's is, because they make the S+ runs of the game feel very different. Where Claire might struggle, Leon does well, and where Leon struggles, Claire often does well. In a nutshell, the most overlooked element of this game is how well the small touches round out the experience. Unfortunately, they are often overlooked by the medium-sized touches that are often missing or asked for. Alright, now I want to talk about the most heavily divisive elements. The parts of the game that cause the most it's Mr. X. Mr. X, being a walking invincible source of stress in unfair circumstances, is this game's strongest crutch, but also its most punishing annoyance. By the middle of the game, both Leon and Claire have enough tools to where zombies aren't likely to be a threat in the larger hallways of RPD. But with Mr. X, any kind of obstacle becomes 10 times more dangerous. If you like spontaneous, unscripted, crazy stories happening organically through the RPD you've helped shape, you probably love Mr. X. On the other hand, if you liked playing this game slow, if you liked taking the time to make a hallway safe, I could see you being annoyed at how you have to constantly keep Mr. X's location in mind, and I could see you being perpetually frustrated at his interference in your plans. So yeah, Mr. X is easily the most consistently scary thing about this game, but also what can make it pretty damn frustrating. Mr. X being in both scenarios is another element of the game that's often controversial. Originally, he was only in Scenario B, and only explicitly hunted the Scenario B character and their respected side character. Now he hunts both characters, but more overtly, hunts Leon. A big issue I have with this is that as the player, both characters are heavily hunted by Mr. X, meaning the villain of the player is only ever properly finished off with Leon. Meaning Claire players never really get full closure on Mr. X in gameplay, only one fake-out cutscene. This also means every scenario is that much more repetitive, as all the campaigns have the same heavy chasing them. Again, given that Mr. X has basically become the most talked about element of this game, it's hard to know if trying to make him more special by keeping him to the B scenarios would have worked out, but it's a contentious topic among some who feel this decision either dilutes his aura or enhances the game as a whole. Zombie durability. Besides Mr. X, the biggest point of confrontation regarding what makes this game hard is how tanky the zombies are in this game. They're the tankiest default enemies of any Resident Evil game. Unlike the original RE2, where zombies aren't really that dangerous unless you're surrounded or low on ammo, these zombies are always dangerous. While this does work to ratchet up the tension of each encounter, it can be very frustrating to pump whole clips into enemies and get nothing out of it. Going for headshots is basically required, and not double tapping the corpses can turn them into extremely annoying landmines. This can also make the strategy seem very one-dimensional, as there's very little reason to do anything besides headshots. There is value in crippling your opponents by blowing off their shins or shooting them until they get stunned so you can run past them, but this isn't exactly intuitive. There's many reasons to dislike how hard a basic enemy like this is, but I don't know if anyone will deny the value to the game they provide. Annette Birkin's characterization. Annette's character was basically a mad scientist who loved her family, and the new one is basically the same but with a few new wrinkles. Annette previously wanted to keep the G virus mostly because she saw it like hers and William's alone. The remake tries to make her a lot more protective, that she's preventing the G virus from harming the world. They also made it so that she's been testing the virus on local orphans. Yeah, this awkward balance is part of what people have an issue with. It feels confused, as if they're simultaneously making her more cartoonishly evil and more believably grounded. While these additions are awkward, they work when she's speaking with the right characters. The more well-received parts of Annette are the updates to the existing scenes, like her stuff with Sherry and her scenes with Ada. Annette's character seems more put together in those scenes, as if she only sees those who take away from her, and that which she wants protected. Scenes with Ada and Sherry are the ones where she feels the most well-realized, but away from those two, Annette doesn't feel as cohesive. The quiet music. The music in this game is very good when you can actually hear it. But it's normally mixed so low that you can never notice it. Given how good a lot of the music in the original is, this can seem like a major downgrade that reduces the personality of the RPD. On the plus side, this enables the game to focus on sound effects, breeding an atmosphere of seen and unseen dangers that are close and that are approaching. This also means that Mr. X has an added layer of presence to him, since his pervasive theme cuts through pretty much all the audio. Blind ambushes are also much less frequent for related reasons, though they can still happen. Leon and Claire's acting. It's a bit unusual how the acting between these two is perceived. I've seen people say that Claire is a worse actor than Leon, and that Leon is a worse actor than Claire. It depends what you're focused on. Claire is a better actor with her eyes, while Leon is a better actor through body language. Claire is a better voice actor when she needs to be expressive, but Leon has a better voice actor when things are quieter. It's not a cut and dry performance evaluation, both have their weaknesses, and I think a lot of the blame is actually on the disparity between the faces of the models and the faces of the actors, but I'll give Claire's actress the nod over Leon's, since she's overall more consistently good with less off moments. Leon as a character. A lot of people wanted Leon to be just like Leon in Resident Evil 4.
Where's everyone going? Bingo?
And as such, many were disappointed by how much more reserved he is in this one. While I understand losing the value of what you love about a character,
You got a smoke?
Got gum.
That probably wouldn't have gelled as well with the tone of this game. Something most people understand. He still has little moments when things are less horrific, and his less confident demeanor is something many have grown to appreciate. In a weird way, the controversial points almost complement each other. Don't like tanky zombies? You definitely won't like Mr. X, so just stop playing now and don't complain, yo wimp. You wanted Quippy Leon? Well, he has 3 main enemies, none of which really make sense for this approach, since 2 are uncaring and the other is too manic to let you get a word in. You wanted memorable music? But then how would you be able to hear the dangerous zombies? Basically, there's enough cohesion between these points of contention to where the game feels consistent. None of the issues of RE6 or the Resident Evil 3 remake where juxtaposed moments just feel off at times. To an extent, they almost gatekeep players and criticism to make the reputation much harder to tarnish, because most of the complaints can just be put into "you don't like horror" or "you wanted an action game." In many ways, the best thing about the controversial elements of Remake 2 is that they feel like deliberate decisions and character flaws rather than the usual incompetence or self-indulgence. Alright, now that all the negativity is out of the way, let's actually break down the most well-received changes to the game. Ada and Sherry's sections. While they're still repetitive in their own way, they are much better than the original and are wisely placed as the transition between the police station and the sewers. Now, they neither disrupt the flow of the exploration nor seem out of place for the storytelling. Quality-wise, Ada is more interesting on repeat playthroughs, while Sherry is more interesting on her first playthrough. Still, both are neat diversions that show the creative potential of using different characters while maintaining what keeps them different. The expansion of Chief Irons and Marvin Branov. Irons is a quiet kind of scary in this game, and his excellent actor makes him feel scarily real.
What are you doing?
Shut up. Tired.
Not as much of a slow burn as his original appearance, but more consistent and blunt in his characterization. Marvin's actor deserves even more credit, turning a relatively small role into one of the most memorable and easily turning in the best acting performance in the game.
And don't make my mistake. If you see one of those things, uniform or not, you do not hesitate.
The addition of self-defense items. How did it take so long for these to come back after the remake of the first game? They are some of the smartest additions to the remake of the first and the remake of the second. In fact, the way they expanded these items is also fantastic. In addition to preventing a single attack when possible, they're some of the strongest weapons either character can use depending on where you are, and there's a great deal of strategy around them to either bypass difficult enemies or to stun difficult bosses. It's tremendous that there's so much importance on decisions like take damage or lose knife. It's a great way of adding layers of depth while smoothing out potentially frustrating areas. The changes to the blue herb. In the original game, if you were decent at avoiding poisonous attacks, you would end up with a box full of unused blue herbs. Not only did they make the blue herbs better by making the poison state even more punishing, they added extra utility by making the blue herbs provide additional defense when combined with red herbs. Extra defense is very valuable when it turns 2-hit kills into 3-hit kills. It's another chance in a very punishing system. Blue herbs went from a barely useful item in the original to one of the most valuable in the remake. They also add to the common Resident Evil philosophy. I can waste inventory space on an item that's useless right now, or I can pick this up later when I may be potentially at risk. This is a beautifully elegant solution to what was originally a fairly useless item. The new window boarding system. The wire was always a weird item in the original game, and its substitute is fantastic. Like anything clogging your inventory, it forces you to explore with a handicap, but gives you much more control over the danger of your environment. It's a very smart way to contextualize endless enemies without removing control from the player's hands. It rewards a player willing to take the time to prepare while enabling some dangerous rooms for those that don't. An under-noticed quality of these positive changes is how well they round out the game. The base system could be extremely frustrating with how quickly damage stacks and how many zombies can occupy a narrow space. Self-defense items give a second chance in dire times, blue herbs reward preparedness while enabling you to heal your wounds, and the window boarding gives the player control over how many zombies respawn in. That's not all, each of these have additional layers of complexity they provide to the game. Most of the self-defense items are also strong items by themselves, so it might be favorable to lose health over losing a precious item. The blue herb defense buff has a time limit to it, meaning that some players could be pushed to heal as late as possible to maximize its utility when entering rooms they know are dangerous. The window boards may be great at keeping numbers low, but you have to decide which windows are the highest priority to block. Irons and Marvin's expansions also make the item collection have an easy focal point. Marvin's directions to get the medallions to eventually escape, and Iron's direction to eventually get the keycard to get Sherry. Ada and Sherry also work well as a transition between stages while setting up the next goals for our respective characters. The most well-received additions to this game from the original were the ones that best complemented the tighter focus on immediate danger and made the preparation against danger its own puzzle. Since the big stuff has all been approached, I'd like to talk about the little problems people have had with this game. The lickers being so fast and so strong. You have two options, walk or stun them until they're dead. They are frustrating at the wrong moments, but not overused or poorly placed. They also lost their infinite stun potential from the original game. The reduction in Ben's part. I heard somebody wanted this character's part expanded. I didn't, but I felt it was worth noting that someone felt sad he died so much faster. This also makes Leon's goal of getting the parking lot key much less memorable. The reduction in the walk to RPD. I heard somebody wanted this part expanded too, but that didn't happen, unless you count the gas station. The grab range of zombies. Zombies grab you near instantaneously if you touch their fingertips. Some have a problem with this because it can make their grab feel unfair, and of course it can feel frustrating to die from a grab like that, but most understand that this is just part of making the zombies dangerous. Though this combined with the two-stage zombie lunge is understandably annoying. No tarantulas. I mean, the G-adults are a much scarier replacement, but yeah, I also miss the tarantulas. And the final niche issue that often gets a lot of attention, the change to the over-the-shoulder camera. Yes, this is a niche. I get that people wanted the Resident Evil 2 remake to be just like the remake of the original game, but I don't think that would have worked. A big reason why many players' favorite Resident Evil game was the original RE2 was because of its balance of action, puzzle, and exploration. RE1 style was a lot more puzzle and navigation focused, so keeping a style that doesn't emphasize action made sense. Action in the Resident Evil remake is about preparation. Action in the original Resident Evil 2 is about letting you cut loose and enjoy the spectacle. Quite simply, the original Resident Evil 2 has too much action, too many zombies, and not enough good puzzles to justify staying in the older style. Had they done so, Claire and Leon would have seemed horribly incompetent rather than just overwhelmed. It reminds me of why Chris seems more pathetic in the remake than he did in the original Resident Evil 1. Because his attempt at being an action hero felt awkward given the changes made to the game. I expected an RE5 style game when this was announced and wished to have something closer to an older style game, but replaying the original made me realize that sticking with the older style would not have worked. Instead, they did the much smarter thing, used the principles of the original game's design and reworked them into the different style using the newer control scheme. And this brings me to my final point about the Resident Evil 2 remake. No remake was ever going to satisfy everyone. For years, I saw different demands for an RE2 remake. Same treatment they gave RE1, expand Ada's portion, RE4 controls with RE2 navigation, literally just a graphical update, give Hunk a part in the main campaign, more action, more puzzles, less Sherry, more story. It's a lot of stuff that's often contradictory and hard to bridge together. That's kind of what impresses me most about the RE2 remake as it is now. That most of the changes seem reasonable, most of the expansions are sensible, and you have to look closely to see the cut corners. The fact that the game came out as focused as it was is kind of a miracle, even if it came at the expense of the scale of it. It seems like the ultimate goal of this game was not necessarily to remake the original RE2 100%. It was to recreate the experience of playing the original RE game at the time of their release. Obviously, you can now play a game in basically a vacuum, but games that pushed graphics, had gratuitous blood, and attempted a dramatic story were the most enticing and appealing to newcomers. People had never seen stuff like this before, and combined with the scale of the game, there was a lot people loved to remember, enough to ignore a lot of the flaws. This memory of RE2 is what was remade. How did Ada die? One tragic and dramatic fall with emotional body language and music? Or a loud chaotic action scene with blunt dialogue? Remake the more memorable one. Though I think the other death made Ada look cooler. How did Annette get mortally wounded? Slashed by her husband who was transformed by their collective work? Or crushed by random debris? Remake the one everyone remembers. The jail reporter and his way too long cutscene? Most people forget about him and remember Ada, so increase her time, trim his. The possibly sexist gun store owner?
But don't you worry, girlie.
Keep the character since it makes too much sense for him to be alive in these conditions, but change it to develop Leon.
Helping people like them? That's why I joined the force.
Everyone remembers Mr. X scaring the crap out of them? Mr. X in both scenarios! And he worked like Nemesis did, which is how a lot of people thought he worked like. There are a lot of little decisions that show what this game really is. A remake of the greatest hits of the original Resident Evil 2. They took Claire A and Leon B, the scenario that made the most consistent sense for the characters, and just brought over the best elements of Leon A, Claire B. For the story of a single scenario, everything is kept that's intrinsic to the character, what's memorable is chosen over the sensible, and what was largely forgotten is dropped or reworked for whatever the remaining needs of the game are. What's left is touched up to make everything feel as grisly and dramatic as the original games when they came out. It seems like they made a gamble. Most people are only going to play the game once, and the ones that play more than once are basically going to gain access to a version of the game that makes the adventure much faster paced. In a bizarre way, while this wasn't what I wanted in a remake of Resident Evil 2, I kind of love this decision. Gameplay isn't hindered by story, and the focus is on the best elements of the game, especially those characteristic of Resident Evil. Resident Evil games may be wildly different, but its gameplay is driven by decision-making when things are calm or crazy, and the best ones add rewarding layers of depth to these decisions. Scenario A is much more bogged down in early game cutscenes and linearity than Scenario B, that Scenario B has actually become my preferred way to play the game now. More options immediately, and the introduction of ammo management is blunt. I was never one of those guys who wanted a remake to immediately ditch the older style, but this system they've made is the best bridge between the older methodical style and a newer action style that I've ever seen. I can't really blame them for focusing on the core gameplay when they've done it this well. I would describe the remake in 3 ways. Smaller but more focused, less of the bad and good elements of the original, and it doesn't fail at anything that it doesn't try. They missed a lot of opportunities, and the package as a whole is worse than the sum of its parts, but they found an accessible system that still serves the functions and the ideals of the original while touching up what everyone remembers. If the Resident Evil 1 remake is what the original game should have been from the start, the Resident Evil 2 remake is a warped but very loving memory of the original's best moments.